The Media Reform Coalition has released a report into media ownership, and its findings show our media is in deep crisis. 7 of the top 15 online platforms used to access news in the UK are controlled by Meta, Google, and X Corp. Google commands 93% of UK search engine use, while Meta and Google together account for 3/5 of all UK advertising spend, giving these two big tech companies unrivaled control over how news is found, accessed, and funded online. Just 3 companies, DMG Media, News UK, and Reach, control 90% of UK national newspaper circulation, a 20% increase in market concentration since 2014. These same 3 companies account for over 40% of the combined reach of the UK's top 50 online news brands, giving these publishers significant power to set and steer the national news agenda. But it's not just the companies. Who specifically owns all of our media? Well, you won't be surprised to who they actually are. Jonathan Harmsworth, Daily Mail and General Trust chairman and sole owner of the Daily Mail and General Trust and great-grandson of the founder of the Daily Mail, Rothermere controls 43% of the UK's national newspaper market through the Daily Mail, Mail on Sunday, the Eye and Metro. The Murdoch family, of course. Rupert Murdoch's News UK controls 1/3 of the national newspaper market. News UK also operates Talk TV, Talk Radio and Talk Sport. Murdoch's News UK has paid out more than £1 billion in legal settlements for victims of phone hacking and press intrusion perpetuated by reporters and private detectives working for News of the World and The Sun. But the company has never been held accountable in an open court. Paul Marshall, co-owner and founder of GB News, as well as owner of Unheard and The Spectator magazine, which he purchased for £100 million in September 2024. Marshall's media titles are highly influential for cementing and establishing conservative views and voices in the wider news agenda. GB News and The Spectator have regularly been found in breach of broadcasting and editorial standards by Ofcom and the press regulator IPSO. And finally, let's take a look at the tech bros who own our social media. So, of course, Elon Musk, Twitter is the UK's 5th most used source for news online. Mark Zuckerberg and Meta. So in the UK, 56% of people who get their news online do so through Meta's websites, apps, and services. Meta also dominates the online advertising market, with Facebook and Instagram accounting for over half, so 7.2 billion in 2025, of all UK display advertising spends. Jeff Bezos, Amazon Prime is the UK's second largest streaming service, while Amazon Music, Audible, and Amazon Smart Speakers dominate the digital audio and music markets. He also owns The Washington Post, purchased in 2013 for $250 million, and is alleged to have directly interfered in the paper's coverage of the 2024 US election after personal meetings with Donald Trump. Now, earlier today, I spoke to Tom Chivers from the Media Reform Coalition and author of the report. So this report you've done for the Media Reform Coalition, I mean, what's the biggest takeaway from the research into media ownership?
I think the biggest takeaway for us in this new edition is that the crisis in media ownership is getting worse. With every time we've done this report, all of the figures are either staying as they are, which is not good because the concentration levels are already very high across their media, or they're getting worse and deeper. So the core statistics that 90% of national newspaper circulation is still controlled by the same 3 dominant publishing giants should really sound an alarm for the state of our media, the state of our news, the state of our politics. In local newspapers as well, the continued decline, the closure of local newspapers is really, really alarming because it means more and more communities, more and more towns and cities around the country are either getting less news or have no local news made in and about their communities whatsoever. Concentrations in broadcast, in radio, in podcasts, in online platforms, especially the online platforms that now determine how much of the online media is distributed and shared and accessed by the UK public. The 3 dominant players, Alphabet that owns Google, Meta that owns Facebook, and X Corp, which owns X/Twitter, these are the dominant players in how information, news, and media is shared and found online. And they are not sharing it in an open and plural and equal way. They have really deep biases and controls, the algorithms and the recommendations that determine how news is shared. All of these systems about how we find news and information online, offline, newspapers, broadcasters, it's all controlled by the same bunch of dominant players whose control and power is getting even worse over time.
I mean, the report shows that billionaires dominate local newspapers, as you mentioned. So despite social media and many news sources being online, is local journalism and local papers still a big influence?
I think local journalism is still very, very important to people. The fact that these local news websites regularly brag about the tens of millions of viewers or tens of millions of readers, the tens of millions in traffic that these websites receive shows that people in their communities really crave. They want to know what's going on in their towns and their local communities. But because so much of that space is dominated by just free large players, NewsQuest, National World, and Reach, their access, the kind of news that's being produced for them is incredibly commercialized, it's incredibly homogenized. Many of these local papers that used to exist as distinct local titles in a town or a community have now been rolled into these very generic online news hubs that might be representing an entire county or an entire region. So people's desire for local news is perhaps stronger than ever because of the opportunities there are with social media, with digital platforms to create new connections with local people. But the news that's being made for local communities is getting further and further detached from actually reporting what's happening on someone's street or in their town.
I want to ask you, when you speak to people, they will say, yeah, I mean, of course, the media is owned by oligarchs. They're owned by a handful of people. That's not surprising. And this report isn't surprising in terms of its conclusion. But I think the levels of concentration is a big deal. And also specifically who, because people have this idea that, okay, it's these sort of cabal of people, but that's it really. And also that also leads to conspiracies, where people sort of make up or put someone in that position in their own minds of who controls the media. But we can see specifically who, right?
I mean, this is the core for why we've been publishing this report for the last 10 years, is people have a sense that the media's broken, it's owned by a few oligarchs, but until they see the statistics and they can attach those statistics to particular large corporations, particular media moguls, and now particular big tech billionaires, there isn't that sense or there isn't that understanding that this, at its core, this is all about market power. This is who controls the means of production of news. This is who owns the channels of how news is produced, accessed, and shared. This is about who pays journalists, how much they pay them. This is about how advertising revenue is generated for news, which is a huge concern not just for the largest newspaper outlets or largest broadcasters or commercial news outlets. It's a huge concern for independent media as well, where if we're trying to set up new platforms and make them financially sustainable, when all of the advertising revenue via online platforms is controlled by basically two companies, Meta and Google, that makes it very difficult for independent platforms to be able to rely on how they're going to get money. And if these platforms decide that the kind of content they're producing isn't attractive to advertisers, and so those independent sources are less favored by advertising, that's a real constraint. That's a direct kind of oppressive mechanism on the kind of news that can make money online. So that's the purpose of this report, is to put real statistics, real evidence on what people understand to already be a very concentrated and very captured media and news landscape, and to point out that these are dangerous levels of market and corporate power, and that by having the statistics, we hope that we can show that there's something that can be done about it. This isn't just the way things have to be. This isn't a natural state of affairs. If we know the shares of the media markets that are owned by the monopolistic corporate giants, if we know just how much of our online media landscape is controlled by the same two companies, if we know and we can name and show with numbers how much the local press has been ruined and dilapidated by these kind of homogenous commercial chain publishers, we can do something about it.
Over the last 30, 40 years, people have really understood that, yes, the media is oligarchical, it's owned by the 1%, and you can't really argue against that. But what you will have is certain people or certain groups of people, particularly on the right, will say, yeah, it's true, but it's owned by the left. The BBC is left-wing. It's left-wing corporations. I would say that's an oxymoron. They would say that, and they're pushing a left-wing agenda. So it's not that people are trying to say, no, there's no conspiracy of corporate ownership of the media. Everybody knows that. And this report, again, doesn't expose something new in that regard. But what is important is to point out that who owns it. It's not the left, as some would say.
Yeah, exactly. And I think on the point of the BBC specifically, there has been a lot of research, academic research, market studies done that show that because the BBC's own news production has declined so precipitously with funding cuts, with its move away from sort of original journalism, actually a lot of the BBC's news agenda is being led more and more by what's going on in the wider media, rather than the BBC itself leading on what should be in the national news agenda. What are the important topics for the day? More often, the BBC is led by the rest of the media, and you see that on their morning news programs where they're shuffling through the national newspapers. You see it on the panelists they invite onto their shows. And that's reflected, or that is a reflection of, the concentration in the wider media markets. If the BBC is relying on what are the papers saying, what are the other big broadcasters saying, what's big on social media, all of those spaces are dominated predominantly by right-wing voices, large corporate oligarchs, big tech billionaires, the same media moguls we've been dealing with in this country for 40 or 50 years. So these accusations of left-wing bias or kind of left-wing monopolies in the news just don't stand up to scrutiny. They don't stand up to the facts and the statistics of who owns the media, what are the big companies, what shares of markets do they own, how much audience control do they have, where is the advertising revenue going. If you look at the relationship between the large online advertising platforms Meta and Alphabet and where a lot of the advertising money is going, it's not being distributed to a plural range of diverse voices across independent and alternative media. It's all being funneled towards the same giant legacy corporations: News UK, DMG Media, Reach. The list goes on, as it does in our report. So the sense that something is wrong with our media is very widespread. The reality is that it's all concentrated towards a small handful of predominantly right-wing corporate giants.
What laws or regulations would you like to see that could tackle the crisis of media ownership? And this is obviously from papers to broadcast to social media.
Straightforwardly, there has to be a cap across all media markets of how large a share any corporate entity can own of any media market. So, say, for example, that no newspaper publisher should be allowed to control more than 30% of that market. That would immediately lead to the breakup of two of the largest publishing companies, which together account for, I think, 70%. If you include Reach, Reach, DMG Media, and News UK, they control 90%. But DMG Media on its own, Lord Rothermere's company, controls almost 50% of national circulation. That's a huge level for a single corporate publisher to control in any one media market. So introducing clear caps that say you cannot own more than this share, whether it's of national newspapers, of the broadcasting sector, radio, online platforms, that's a simple way of starting to break up the concentrated corporate power. I think beyond that, we also have to start looking at public interest obligations. So not just breaking up market power, but where there are concentrations of market power, reversing it and making it work to the benefit of the public and to the benefit of a more plural and diverse news landscape. So you could say, for example, well, you as a company own 30% of the media market. You're not allowed to go over that due to a market cap, but that's still a huge share for any one company to own of a media market. There should be responsibilities on the largest companies, even below the cap, to invest in investigative reporting or to help subsidize independent and local sources of news as a way of kind of remedying and reversing what has gone wrong in the media markets beyond ownership concentration, the collapse in journalism, the collapse in local news, requiring the largest corporate players to have public responsibilities through obligations that would be applied to them if they owned larger shares of a media market. I think, lastly, beyond that as well, we have to have a fit and proper persons test that actually asks who owns our media, what kind of commitments do they have to independent, rigorous, accurate, ethical news production, ethical media production, and having tests that say if you're trying to own or purchase a slice of our media, you should have to pass a pretty high bar for the kind of responsibilities and standards we would expect in a democratic society for the kind of power that owning media gives to somebody. So the mix of those three things: market caps that say you cannot own more than a certain amount as a basic anti-monopoly measure, public interest obligations that put public responsibilities on the people who own the media, and a fit and proper persons test that would stop people who have been shown to be engaged in corporate corruption, in illegal or unethical practices, who are simply not fit and proper to own our media. Those three measures together, I think, are essential to try and restore plurality and diversity to our media landscape.
That was Tom Chivers from the Media Reform Coalition. Sarah, I want to get your thoughts on this. The media is the biggest obstacle, I think, to change, right? It's why we do what we do, right? You know, support turn left. But it's not a secret that the media is owned by oligarchs, but it's getting worse, especially social media.
Yeah, it's an oligarchy, no question. Like you say it all the time in the support video, like get rid of the oligarchs. It's true. But now I think it's like a digitally supercharged one. Like it's on. What's something that makes you go like that? I don't know. Something that makes you go crazy. Like I think we've gone from press barons dominating front pages to algorithms shaping entire worldviews, and that's a really scary time to be in. And I think that's a dangerous like feedback loop because we've got big tech boys, big tech extracts, advertising, and then that entrenches existing media monopolies. And I think it makes disinformation very, very profitable. I think we've seen it happen with plenty of events that have happened within recent history. And then we're seeing the profit that is made off of that. And it's not just a British problem, but this is a global problem. I think Canada's got its own battle with Meta at the moment over news payments. And that's showing how ruthless these platforms are. Zuckerberg, I think, simply pulled news entirely from Facebook feeds. And in Australia, I think they've got a similar force that's happening over there. But speaking about Britain's history, I think historically, they have failed to implement the full Leveson reforms. And it's kind of like left the door wide open for this oligarchic consolidation. The Murdoch playbook of bending politics to media empires has now gone global. And today's tech billionaires make Murdoch look quite quaint. And if that's not scary, I don't know what is.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.